All right, so today we're diving into Ulysses by James Joyce.
Oh, yes.
And, this is a book that people have probably heard of as a really dense and complicated book.
Hmm.
But we're going to unpack it a little bit and talk about what makes it such a landmark novel and tell the story.
Absolutely.
We have an expert on all things Joyce here to help us.
That's right. I'm excited.
So for our listeners, can you just give us a little overview of Ulysses?
Yeah. So Ulysses follows one day in Dublin, June 16th, 1904.
Okay.
And it follows three main characters, Leopold Bloom, his wife Molly, and Stephen Dedalus.
Okay.
And the brilliance of it is that it parallels their experiences with Homer's Odyssey. So it elevates everyday life to these epic proportions.
Okay, so I'm picturing Dublin 1904, these characters walking around.
Yeah.
And the book is known for its, episode structure, right?
Yes. So Ulysses is structured in 18 episodes, each with a distinct style, and you're going to experience stream of consciousness where you're just inside the characters' heads, and it can feel chaotic. But it's so masterful in how Joyce captures the way we think.
So let's jump into episode 1, Telemachus.
Okay.
Who do we meet first?
All right, so we meet Stephen Dedalus, and he's a young artist living in a Martello tower with two other men,
Okay.
Buck Mulligan and Haynes, an Englishman. And right away, there's this tension. Stephen feels like an outsider. He doesn't really fit with their personalities.
So right from the start, we have this theme of alienation.
Exactly, and you'll see that throughout the novel.
Okay.
Later in the episode, Stephen goes to teach a history lesson at a boys' school, and we get this glimpse of his intellectual side, but also his struggle with grief over his mother's death.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So while Stephen's dealing with loss and searching for his purpose, I guess where do we find Leopold Bloom?
Yeah, so we meet Bloom at home, preparing breakfast for Molly, and it's a stark contrast to Stephen's intellectual world. Bloom's is very domestic and ordinary.
Yeah.
But even in that, Joyce reveals so much.
Okay.
We see that Bloom is thoughtful and attentive to Molly, while she comes across as more sensual and independent.
So it's really like those everyday moments, but you can tell a lot about the character.
Exactly.
So episode 2, Nestor focuses on Stephen again.
Yes, so we're back in the classroom with Stephen as he teaches history.
Yeah.
But it's more than just a lesson. It's Stephen wrestling with the nature of history itself, his place within it.
So he's almost teaching himself as much as he's teaching the students.
Absolutely. And there's this key moment when Stephen has a conversation with his employer, Mr. Deasy,
Okay.
who gives him a letter to deliver to a newspaper, and it becomes this symbolic task leading Stephen further into the heart of Dublin.
Okay, so even the smallest details are really layered with meaning.
Yeah.
So while Stephen's on this errand, where's Leopold? What's he doing?
Yeah, so in Nestor, we don't see Bloom at all. Joyce keeps their paths separate for now, building the anticipation for when they finally meet.
Okay, so parallel storylines.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Building tension.
So episode 3 is Proteus, and this is known to be a pretty challenging episode.
It is.
So what happened?
So we're back with Stephen walking along Sandy Mount Strand, and this is where the stream of consciousness really takes hold.
Oh, okay.
It's this deep dive into his thoughts, philosophy, religion, childhood memories, even the meaning of life. The language becomes almost poetic, mirroring the flow of his inner world.
So you really have to work to make sense of everything.
You do, but that's part of the brilliance. You're actively engaged in Stephen's thought process.
Okay.
And it's significant that he's on the Strand because it foreshadows Bloom's own journey through Dublin later on.
Oh, so their journeys are starting to kind of echo each other, even though they haven't met.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So then in episode 4, Calypso, we get back to Mr. Bloom.
Yes. Bloom is at home again, starting his day, making breakfast, feeding the cat, even a visit to the outhouse. It's very grounded, almost mundane compared to Stephen's philosophical wanderings.
Yeah, totally different.
Right, but even in this, Joyce reveals these deeper layers. We see Bloom's practical nature, his sharp observations of the world around him, his love for Molly. There's a touching scene where he brings her breakfast in bed and reads her a letter.
Oh,
But there's also a hint of sadness, a longing.
okay.
Bloom thinks about their deceased son, Rudy, and he suspects Molly might be having an affair.
Oh, so there's complexity in their relationship already.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what else happens in Calypso?
Well, Bloom goes about his day running errands to the butcher, the post office, the chemist. We even see him reading a letter from a woman he's secretly corresponding with.
Oh my gosh.
Quite a contrast to the devoted husband we saw earlier.
Yeah.
And there's this seemingly insignificant moment where he bumps into Bantam Lions, who misunderstand something Bloom says about a horse race, thinking it's a tip, and this will come back later in the book.
Okay, so Joyce is planting those seeds?
Oh.
Okay, so then we move into episode 5, Lotus Eaters.
Yeah.
And Bloom is still doing his errands.
That's right. He's still out and about in Dublin, the bank, a mass, even a bathhouse.
Wow.
He's constantly observing people, but he's also lost in thought memories of his courtship with Molly, thoughts of their daughter Millie, and contemplating his own identity.
So even while he's, like, engaged in the city, he's on an internal journey.
Exactly. And one scene that stands out is when Bloom attends a Catholic mass.
Oh, interesting.
Even though he's Jewish, he's drawn to the beauty and ritual of the service. It shows his openness to experience and his search for meaning.
He's a complex character.
Yeah.
Okay, so Hades episode 6 takes Bloom to a funeral.
Yes, the funeral of Paddy Dignam, a man from his neighborhood, and Bloom rides in a carriage with 3 other men. And it's interesting because while it's a somber occasion, Bloom's thoughts drift towards death itself. He thinks about his own mortality, Rudy's death, and his relationship with his father.
Wow, so it's not just attending a funeral, it's like confronting the idea of death.
Exactly. And Joyce subtly highlights Bloom's outsider status here. You know, he's treated a little differently by the other men, reinforcing this sense of not quite belonging.
Okay, so again, layering those themes.
Yeah.
So episode 7, Aeolus, we're in a whole new setting, the offices of the Freeman newspaper.
Yes.
What's Bloom doing there?
So he's trying to secure an advertising contract for a client.
Right.
And this episode is really fascinating because Joyce plays with the style here.
Yeah.
He mimics the layout and language of a newspaper.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, emphasizing the power of language and communication.
So the form is like reflecting the content.
Exactly. We see Bloom's cleverness and adaptability in this fast-paced world. But we also see the subtle anti-Semitism he faces, reminding us of his outsider status.
Yeah.
And in the end, the editor rejects his proposal, adding to Bloom's sense of frustration.
So professional setback and a reminder of the barriers he faces.
Yes.
Does Stephen make an appearance in Aeolus?
He does. He arrives with the letter from Mr. Deasy, the one he was tasked with delivering. But in typical Joyce fashion, he arrives just as Bloom is leaving.
Oh, they just miss each other.
Yeah. They're circling each other, but their paths haven't converged yet.
Okay, so Lestrygonians, episode 8, we find Bloom where?
So we find Bloom wandering through Dublin around lunchtime.
Okay.
He's hungry, he's searching for a place to eat, but as always, his mind is on other things.
Yeah.
He's thinking about Molly's planned rendezvous with her lover Blazes Boylan.
Oh.
And observing the people around him, their eating habits, their interactions.
Okay, so like basic human needs food connection.
Yeah.
But also like those anxieties that are bubbling beneath the surface.
Exactly. Bloom's hunger becomes a metaphor for these deeper longings, his dissatisfaction. And there's this striking moment when he encounters a blind stripling, which triggers a wave of compassion in him, highlighting his empathy.
Okay, so even in his own turmoil, he's still able to feel for others.
Yeah.
So episode 9, we're back to a more intellectual setting, the National Library of Ireland.
Yes, Scylla and Charybdis.
And what happens here?
Stephen is the center of attention here. He's holding court with a group of intellectuals debating Shakespeare and Hamlet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So like a battle of wits.
Stephen is brilliant, but he faces resistance, even ridicule.
Okay.
It's a struggle for artistic expression and recognition.
So what about Bloom? Is he at the library too?
He is. He briefly visits to check on an advertisement he's working on, but yet again, they're in close proximity, but they don't actually meet.
Oh my gosh. The tension is building.
I know, right?
I'm so curious to see when these two are going to collide.
Yeah, me too. Now, episode 10, Wandering Rocks, this is where Joyce, he gets really experimental.
Okay.
So instead of focusing on Stephen or Bloom, he gives us like this kaleidoscopic view of Dublin itself.
So we're like zooming out, seeing the city as a whole?
Exactly. It's like a cinematic montage, these quick cuts between dozens of characters going about their day, their paths intersecting, diverging. It's meant to show how everything is interconnected. How even those who never meet are still part of this larger tapestry of Dublin life.
So do we get glimpses of Stephen and Bloom amidst this?
We do brief glimpses, each going about their business, but their paths still haven't crossed directly.
Yeah.
They're still on those parallel tracks, you know?
Building the anticipation.
Heading towards that inevitable meeting.
Okay, so episode 11, Sirens, takes us to the Ormond Hotel Bar.
Yes.
And what's the vibe there?
Think music, sensuality, seduction.
Okay.
Joyce structures this episode like a fugue with recurring motifs, interwoven conversations. It's about the power of sound language, how it draws you in.
So a chapter that's meant to be heard more than read?
Absolutely. Puns, wordplay, onomatopoeia. Joyce uses it all to create this symphony of sound and sensation.
So where are Stephen and Bloom in this sonic landscape?
So Bloom is in the Orman restaurant, nursing his wounded heart. He spots Blaze's Boylan Molly's lover heading to their rendezvous. So it's a confirmation of his suspicions, and Bloom is consumed by jealousy. He tries to distract himself by writing a letter to his secret correspondent.
Wow. Okay, so while Bloom is wrestling with betrayal, what's Stephen doing?
Stephen arrives at the bar later with his friend Lynch.
Okay.
They're deep in philosophical discussion about art and aesthetics, completely oblivious to Bloom's heartbreak nearby.
Oh my gosh, they're so close, but so far.
I know.
Do they at least, like, see each other?
There's a moment where they're in close proximity, but Bloom, lost in thought, he doesn't even notice Stephen.
Oh my gosh.
The tension continues to build.
Okay, so episode 12, Cyclops. We're back to Bloom.
Yes.
Where do we find him?
So we're in Barney Kiernan's pub.
Okay.
Very different atmosphere from the elegant Ormond.
Yeah.
Bloom is there to meet Martin Cunningham about the Dignam family finances, but he encounters something much more volatile.
What is it?
Prejudice.
Okay.
So the episode is narrated by this unnamed character, the citizen,
Okay.
and he's like this staunch Irish nationalist, but embodies the dark side of that patriotism. He targets Bloom with insults, veiled threats, all fueled by anti-Semitism.
Wow. So Bloom's Jewish identity, which has been kind of there throughout the whole book, is now like front and center.
Yes.
A source of conflict.
It's a powerful exploration of xenophobia, the dangers of blind nationalism.
Yeah.
Bloom, despite being outnumbered, tries to argue for reason tolerance.
I'm guessing it doesn't then. Well,
It doesn't. The tension escalates, the citizen becomes aggressive, and Bloom, in a moment of defiance, stands up for himself.
wow.
It leads to a physical altercation outside the pub.
Oh my God.
So it's literally a fight for recognition for his right to belong.
wow.
It highlights those real consequences of intolerance.
Yeah.
Luckily, Martin Cunningham witnesses the scene and helps Bloom escape in a carriage, but Bloom is left shaken, deeply affected by this encounter.
That's a powerful image of him, like, fleeing this outburst of hatred.
Yeah.
Is Stephen there at all?
No, Stephen is absent from Cyclops. It's a chapter that focuses solely on Bloom and his experience of anti-Semitism in Dublin.
Okay, so Bloom's journey has taken a dark turn.
Yeah.
Episode 13, Nausicaa. Where are we?
So we're back on Sandymount Strand, but it's a different time of day sunset, and the focus shifts to a new character, Gertie McDowell.
Okay, tell me about Gertie.
So she's young, romantic, somewhat naive. She's out with friends, but she's preoccupied with thoughts of love, marriage, beauty.
Okay.
Very different from the intellectual world of Stephen or Bloom's practical concerns.
Yeah, and how does Bloom fit into this?
So Bloom is also on the Strand, observing the people around him as usual.
Right.
But his attention is drawn to Gertie, particularly her ankles and legs.
Okay.
It's a complex exploration of desire, the male gaze voyeurism.
So things are getting a bit complicated here.
They are. As Gertie becomes aware of Bloom's attention, she engages in this subtle display of her femininity, adjusting her skirt, revealing more of her legs.
So like a kind of unspoken flirtation, but with like a darker undercurrent.
Exactly, and ultimately lost in his own fantasies. Bloom masturbates while watching Gertie. It's a controversial scene. One that raises questions about power dynamics and the objectification of women.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So where does this leave Bloom?
So Gertie leaves the Strand completely oblivious to Bloom's actions, and Bloom falls asleep on the beach, perhaps seeking a kind of release from the tension and desire that he's been experiencing.
Okay, so another episode that ends with Bloom alone and kind of in this uneasy state.
Yeah.
So episode 14, Oxen of the Sun, takes us to the Hollis Street Maternity Hospital.
Yes, and this episode is a whirlwind of language and style. It mimics the evolution of English prose, starting with ancient forms and progressing to the modern era.
Wow.
It's dense, challenging, but also incredibly inventive.
So like the style itself is mirroring this theme of birth, growth, evolution.
Exactly, and it's all happening against the backdrop of Mina Purefoy's labor, a process that's both painful and miraculous.
So are Stephen and Bloom at the hospital?
They are. Stephen is there with a group of medical students,
Okay.
drinking and carousing while they await news of the birth. Bloom arrives later, having come to check on Mina Purefoy, who he knows from his neighborhood.
So after all this buildup, they're finally in the same room.
Yes.
Do they meet?
They do. They're introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and they share a brief, slightly awkward conversation.
Okay.
Stephen is drunk. Bloom is more reserved, but there's this spark of recognition, this sense of connection that transcends their differences.
Finally.
I know.
I was wondering if they'd ever actually meet.
Me too.
What happens next?
So the group of men, including Stephen Bloom, they head to Burke's pub to continue the festivities.
Okay.
Oxen of the Sun gives way to episode 15, Circe, and things take a sharp turn into the surreal.
Okay. This is known as like one of the most challenging chapters.
Yeah, it is.
What makes it so unique?
It's like entering a hallucinatory dreamscape.
Wow.
The setting is the brothel district of Dublin, and the episode is filled with bizarre characters, erotic fantasies, nightmarish visions. It's a descent into the subconscious where the boundaries between reality and fantasy blur.
So how do Stephen and Bloom navigate this, like, crazy world?
So Stephen is completely inebriated and lost in his own internal struggles. He encounters figures from his past, confronts his deepest fears, and ultimately succumbs to the chaos of the night. Bloom, meanwhile, arrives at the brothel searching for Stephen, concerned about his well-being.
Oh, wow. So he's like a protector.
Yeah, he feels a paternal instinct towards Stephen, this sense of responsibility for his safety, and there's a pivotal moment where Bloom finds Stephen in distress, having gotten into a fight and been knocked unconscious.
Oh, no.
Bloom intervenes, protects Stephen from further harm, and helps him to his feet.
Oh, wow.
So it's this powerful moment that shows the depth of Bloom's compassion.
Yeah.
It strengthens the bond between them.
So despite all the hallucinations and weirdness,
Yeah.
there's this, like, human connection emerging.
It is a turning point in their relationship. It solidifies their connection in this surreal and chaotic world.
So what happens after they leave the brothel district?
Bloom takes Stephen to a nearby cabman shelter where they can sober up and have a cup of coffee. Episode 16, Eumaeus, offers this moment of quiet reflection after the intense experience of Circe.
So a chance for them to, like, catch their breath.
Exactly. It's a quieter, more introspective chapter.
Okay.
We see Bloom and Stephen talking about their lives, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and disappointments.
So what do they talk about?
Bloom opens up about his love for Molly, his grief over the loss of their son Rudy, and his sense of alienation in Dublin. Stephen, in turn, talks about his artistic aspirations, his complicated relationship with his father, and his own search for meaning.
Wow. So they're really, like, being vulnerable with each other.
Yes, and despite their age difference and vastly different life experiences, they form a genuine connection.
Why?
It's a beautiful moment of human connection amidst the chaos and complexity of their day.
Okay, so after all the craziness of their journey, it seems like they've found some solace in each other.
Mm-hmm.
What happens after their heart-to-heart at the cabman shelter?
Yeah. So as their night together comes to a close, Bloom invites Stephen back to his house for a cup of cocoa and just a chance to rest.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephen, he's hesitant at first, but he accepts.
Okay.
And they walk back to Bloom's house together, and their conversation, becomes quieter, more intimate as they go. And this leads us to episode 17, Ithaca,
Okay.
which is another experimental chapter, this time written in this very detached question and answer style.
So after all the, like, emotion and the craziness, we're suddenly, like, shifting to a more analytical, more scientific tone.
Exactly. It's like Joyce is holding a magnifying glass to these very ordinary actions,
Yeah.
like making cocoa, talking about everyday things. But amidst that, they're discussing these profound questions about life, the universe,
Right.
everything.
So it's those simple moments, but they're imbued with so much depth.
Exactly.
So what do we learn about Stephen and Bloom's relationship during this time at Bloom's house?
Well, we see the dynamic shift. Bloom is almost in awe of Stephen's intellect and this youthful idealism,
Okay.
while Stephen seems drawn to Bloom's warmth and compassion. It's clear they both see something in the other that they perhaps lack in themselves.
Yeah, there's that, like, mutual respect and understanding.
Yeah, and Bloom shows Stephen a photo album of his family, Molly, their deceased son Rudy, and their daughter Millie.
Oh, wow.
It's an incredibly intimate gesture, sharing these precious memories with someone he barely knows.
Yeah, that shows a lot of trust.
Yeah, and Stephen's clearly touched by Bloom's openness.
Okay.
You can sense that Stephen, who has this strained relationship with his own father, sees something in Bloom that he yearns for,
Yeah.
A kind of paternal warmth and acceptance.
Yeah, it's a beautiful moment of connection between these two very different men.
It is.
Does Stephen stay the night?
So Bloom offers him a place to stay, but Stephen ultimately decides to leave.
Okay.
They share this final moment on the doorstep looking up at the night sky, and then Stephen bids Bloom farewell.
A bittersweet ending to their time together.
Yeah, it really is. And you wonder if their paths will ever cross again.
Yeah, for sure. So what happens to Bloom after Stephen leaves?
He goes back inside, still thinking about Stephen, and discovers evidence of Molly's affair with Blaze's Boylan.
Oh, no.
It's this confirmation of his suspicions that's both heartbreaking and somehow inevitable.
Yeah. And after everything that he's gone through that day, how does he react?
It's remarkable he doesn't react with anger or jealousy.
Wow.
Instead, there's a sense of resignation, a quiet acceptance of this painful truth. It speaks to Bloom's capacity for empathy, even for those who have hurt him.
Yeah, it's a powerful moment of grace amidst all the messiness of their relationships. So we arrive at the final episode of Ulysses' Penelope.
Yes.
And the focus shifts entirely to Molly Bloom.
Yes, Penelope is Molly's episode, and it's quite a departure from everything that's come before. It's a single, uninterrupted soliloquy.
Wow.
This stream of consciousness that flows freely through Molly's thoughts and memories.
So after all this time with Stephen and Bloom, we finally hear from, the woman at the heart of the story.
Yeah, and Molly is a force of nature. She's sensual, intelligent, fiercely independent, and completely unapologetic about her desires. Her voice is vibrant, uninhibited, and she speaks frankly about everything: sex, love, marriage, motherhood. It's a groundbreaking portrayal of female subjectivity that challenged all the norms of its time.
Yeah, I bet it was controversial.
Oh, it was. Ulysses was banned in several countries for its perceived obscenity, largely due to Molly's soliloquy. But that controversy also speaks to its power, its ability to challenge our assumptions and make us think differently about female sexuality and desire.
Yeah, so what's going through Molly's mind in this soliloquy?
Her thoughts range widely from her childhood in Gibraltar to her life with Bloom, her affair with Blaze's Boylan, her dreams for the future. We get this panoramic view of her life, her loves, her losses, all filtered through her unique and often humorous perspective.
So how does she feel about Bloom?
Her feelings are complex.
Okay.
She loves him, she's frustrated by him, she desires him, she resents him. It's a very real portrayal of a long-term relationship with all its passion and contradictions.
Yeah.
You know,
Does she regret the affair?
not really. She sees it as a separate part of her life, a physical experience that doesn't diminish her love for Bloom. She's not interested in judging herself or adhering to societal expectations.
So she's a woman who defines herself on her own terms.
Absolutely.
That's really empowering.
It is. And what feeling do you get from her soliloquy?
Yeah.
It's an affirmation of life, a celebration of female experience in all its complexity. And despite the betrayals and the heartbreaks, there's this vibrancy, this life force that runs through Molly's words, and her final word, yes, is this powerful testament to her enduring spirit, her embrace of all that life has to offer.
Wow, it's an unforgettable ending to an extraordinary book. We've journeyed through the minds of Stephen Bloom, and finally, Molly and I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Right, that's the beauty of it. It's a book that rewards multiple readings, deep contemplation.
Yeah.
There's always something new to discover in Joyce's language, his characters, his world.
So for our listeners who are ready to take the plunge, what advice would you give them?
Don't be afraid to get lost. Embrace the challenge, savor the language, and be open to the beauty and humor that emerges from the chaos. There are resources out there if you need guidance. But ultimately, the best way to experience Ulysses is to dive in and let it wash over you.
Well said. And remember, even if you don't grasp every single nuance or reference, the journey itself is worth it. It's a chance to experience a masterpiece of modern literature and discover something new about yourself along the way.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us in this deep dive into Ulysses.
It's been a pleasure. Happy reading, everyone.